proposals that people think that should be created. And if somebody doesn't offer that, we'll, wait just a minute, I have to admit something. There we go. Anyway, that's how it will work. So May 15th is a due date. We look forward to receiving a lot of proposals. And with that, time to hear our speaker. David Williams is the vice president who arranges all these fine programs, the fine ones that have occurred after I was vice president. But he's doing a great job, but he couldn't be here tonight, so I get to introduce the speaker. And it's kind of appropriate. Speaking of revisiting a facet of regional history, Ana Maria Spagna will speak about her book, Pushed, Miners, a Merchant, and Maybe a Massacre. And this is the most recent of her long list of well-received writings. Her nonfiction books on nature, work, community, and civil rights include a book called Reclaimers, which are stories of elder women reclaiming sacred land and water. That book was a finalist for the Rachel Carson Book Award from the Society of Environmental Journalists. And another book is Test Ride on the Sunnyland Bus, A Daughter's Civil Rights Journey, which is a memoir history that won the River Teeth Literary Nonfiction Prize. She also has 3 published essay collections and a chapbook of poetry. And also, she's the author of a published novel for young people, The Luckiest Scar on Earth, about a 14-year-old snowboarder and her activist father. I don't know if you know, Ana Maria, but the speakers we had last month were fiction writers, and they talked about how they worked to make sure that the history in their fiction was correct. So it was very well received. So I was interested to see that you are also doing such things. Ana Maria's work has been recognized by the Nautilus Book Awards, the Pacific Northwest Booksellers Awards, and she's a 4-time finalist for the Washington State Book Award. And one pictures her having spent her entire life busy at a desk, but she spent 15 years on backcountry trail crews for the National Park Service before turning to teaching. She's currently on the faculty in the low residency MFA programs at Antioch University in Los Angeles and also Western Colorado University. She spent a year as the Johnston Visiting Professor at Whitman College, and she's been the William Kittredge Distinguished Writer in Residence at the University of Montana. And right now, she's in her 3rd and last year as the V. Bronze Visiting Professor of Creative Writing at St. Lawrence University in Canton, New York, where she is at the moment. And it's 10 p.m. there, so I should stop and let her speak. So Ana Maria, the floor is yours. I'm going to, I think you can now share. We'll make sure that works.
Great. Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here. I'm delighted to be invited and such a treat to talk to other people who have been on similar journeys, I suspect, in hunting down lost history. So I will share my screen here. You can, I've got some slides we can look at while I'm speaking. There we go. You should be seeing the cover of my book. Are you seeing that all right?
Yep.
All right. Wonderful. So I'm going to talk about Pushed, which is the story of the 1875 Chelan Falls Massacre. It's a story that's retold a lot in small local museums. You can read about it at the Rocky Reach Dam and at local museums and in regional histories, but kind of a bare bones story. And so I spent about 5 years researching, trying to figure out what exactly happened right here in my backyard. That long bio doesn't mention that I lived most of my adult life, about 30 years in Stehekin, Washington, at the north end of Lake Chelan. And this event happened at the other end, at the Chelan end of the lake. I'll show a map in a minute. I'm going to talk about a little bit of my journey, of how I came to this story. I'm going to read a little bit from the book, from the prologue. I think that gives you the best sense of all of what goes into this, and then I'll talk about the historical and the geographical context, and leave some time hopefully for some questions. So I'm going to jump back and just for a minute talk about, well, maybe not. Maybe I'll just start right in. I was going to talk about my previous book, which was Test Ride on the Sunnyland Bus, uh, A Daughter's Civil Rights Journey. And the reason I bring this book up is because that book was the one that introduced me to this kind of digging into history. My father was involved in a little known event in the civil rights movement, the Tallahassee bus boycott, but he died when I was 11, and so I never heard about it from him. And so I ended up just having to go blind into into research. I was writing letters, handwriting letters to anyone with the right name who might have been a witness to the events he took part in, and miraculously I did find them. And it was so gratifying to meet the heroes and sheroes of the movement. But I have to say that that book probably made me a little overconfident coming into this project, which being set in 1875, I was not likely to find living witnesses. And because it's about a marginalized group, an underrepresented group, the Chinese miners along the Columbia River, there really aren't written accounts. So it was an entirely different kind of a journey. And I'm going to start at the beginning. And as I said, just read a little bit from the prologue. A few years ago, while waiting for the ferry to Stehekin, I browsed the shelves at Riverwalk Books in Chelan and picked up a thin paperback titled Wapato Heritage, The History of the Chelan and Entiat Indians by Tom Hackenmiller. Why? Because a new tugging had begun. Simple questions that may be easy enough to answer in some places are murkier here. Who came before us? What did they do? Who and what did they love? How did they experience red heather ridges or 2 long winter nights? As I read and reread Wapato Heritage, another story snagged my attention. This one wasn't exactly about the original inhabitants, or not them alone. In the late 1860s, a Chinese merchant settled on the bank of the Columbia River right across from Chelan Falls, where Beebe Bridge Park now sits. The merchant ran a thriving business, the first of its kind along this rugged upper stretch of the river, and he catered to indigenous, Chinese, and white people alike. But within a decade, tensions grew heated. One day, on a high bluff within view of his store, according to lore, a group of indigenous people murdered a large number of Chinese miners, perhaps as many as 300, and pushed the bodies over a cliff into the Columbia. Locals dubbed the event the Chelan Falls Massacre. A massacre, perhaps as many as 300 killed? Why had I never heard this story? The truth is, I'd never even heard about Chinese gold miners along the Columbia, though I should have. I knew very little about Chinese people in the American West, though I'd lived my entire life there. I also didn't know why indigenous people would feel animosity toward Chinese miners, though I could make a few guesses. Innate distrust, prescient protectionism, sheer frustration. But I did know Beebe Bridge Park, a flat, grassy campground constructed in the mid-1990s and popular with RVers in summer. I'd often camped there on my way to or from the once-a-day ferry. Beebe Bridge had always seemed a nondescript, in-between sort of place, alluring only for its proximity to water in this dry region, or in my case, for its cheap, clean showers. To think of Beebe Bridge as historically relevant felt surprising, astonishing even, a welcome challenge to assumptions I didn't even know I'd held. The simple connection at first spurred the tugging. The story grew more complicated. Not long after beginning research in earnest, I began to hear another theory about the Chelan Falls Massacre, first as a scandalous whisper, you know what they say. Then as a steady hum, sons and daughters of the sons and daughters of the first white settlers voiced the possibility. A Natural History of the Columbia River, Native River by William Layman, quoted a later merchant, Chiwe Yu, saying the same thing. The attackers weren't indigenous people. They were white men dressed up to look indigenous. The possibility infuriated me. Of course, xenophobia is not innate, but instilled, a political tool and excuse. None of this was new, none of this could be substantiated, and because the facts remained so murky, I'd learned, some historians believe the massacre never occurred at all. Suddenly, a made-up massacre seemed possible too. If a place comes to own you, does its history own you too? I believe it does. I've read 1,000 pages and driven hundreds of miles trying to figure out the truth about this forgotten massacre. I used to think of forgetting as benign, such a gentle verb, to forget, a venial sin. Now I am not so sure. I own land in Chelan County. I've benefited as much as anyone and more than most from the murders of non-white people. The sin of forgetting, venial or mortal, is at least partly mine. I didn't always think this way. Maybe moving away changed my perspective, or maybe middle age did. Certainly, I've gained a broader understanding of history thanks to good historians and, ironically enough, to bad politicians. So call this a remembering, a search with no end, a river with multiple sloughs, a group of indigenous people massacred a few Chinese men, or 300 of them, or white men massacred them, or it didn't happen at all. Tributaries trickle and flood and sometimes run dry. Who believes which story and why? Why tell the story at all? Every hillside, every valley, every plain and grove has been hallowed by some sad or happy event in days long vanished. Chief Sealth famously said, or may have said, in 1854 in response to a proposed treaty that effectively stole a large chunk of his homeland. Even the rocks, which seem to be dumb and dead as they swelter in the sun along the silent shore, thrill with memories of stirring events. It's a perspective we colonizers either romanticize or dismiss, but rarely acknowledge as plain fact or plain lack. We've lost the sense of comfort and complicity such connection can spawn, and maybe one way to nurture understanding, to suture some semblance of wholeness, is to unbury stories of what humans did right here. So that was the start. So much of it stemmed from just how close it was to my home, a place that I knew so very well. I'm assuming many of you, most of you know this geography, but in case you don't, here's the map of Washington State. This is Lake Chelan. It's 55 miles long skinny lake, a natural lake, although it's been dammed and the level is raised. I live in Stehekin here at this end, and here is Chelan at this end. The lake then goes through a gorge and down to the Columbia River, and it's right here at the junction of the Chelan River and the Columbia River where the massacre supposedly occurred. Also right at that spot is the Chinese store that the merchant of the title of the book ran. It was, by many accounts, the first business in North Central Washington. It was a thriving business in the 1860s. This is an 1887 plat. I'm grateful to Lindsay Evanson, who wrote a fantastic master's thesis at Eastern Washington University about the Chinese miners along the Columbia. So you can see that it's a going concern, this Chinese store. And there are lots of accounts once I started digging into historical society records. The Okanagan and borderlands up by Oroville have great records. But I was trying to figure out who is this merchant? And of course, there's no record of his name, although if you go through, there are census records. They're terribly underreported for that era, but lots and lots of Chinese miners on those census records, many of them with the first name listed as Ah, which in Chinese, it would be like uncle or Mr. So Ah, Ah Chin, Ah Chan, and Ah Chi is the oldest of them on those records. And the records of the massacre as they exist, the articles that describe it, talk about the Chinese merchant being old. And so I do think it was probably Ah Chi. And later we see him appear as Chisa, which you may recognize that name. It is a tiny town up in the Okanagan, and is actually the only town in the whole contiguous 48 states that is named for a Chinese immigrant. So that's our merchant. and that's his store there, a going concern again in the 1860s, 1870s, early 1870s. And the merchants, the miners are doing well along that stretch of the river. It had been mined originally by white miners, the 49ers, as they moved through coming from California, going up into BC, and thought they had cleaned it out. But here come the Chinese miners, and they found much more gold, which of course did not please the white miners who had not been so successful. And a lot of the lore says that it's because they were hard workers, because they just worked so hard, which sounds like a compliment, but also can be a bit demeaning when you consider some of the actual reasons, including that most of these men, later, a lot of miners in the region were employed by what they called the Big Six. They were kind of indentured servants to these 6 companies from China that would pay their fare to come and work in exchange for a cut of their wages. These were not. These were early independent miners, much like the 49ers that we read about. But they all came from Guangdong region in China, or most of them did, which is a region long known for its irrigation techniques and technologies. So they came with a bunch of knowledge of how to use water. And you can see this is what is called a rocker. It would be a contraption that they built so that they didn't have to just pan for gold, as you would see, you were familiar with from historical reenactments. So they've got an actual device that they can use that makes it much easier. They can put the diggings in the top there, pour the water through, and then there's quicksilver or mercury on the bottom level to catch the gold dust. So they have technology. In order to use this technology, and in the next picture you see a more sophisticated version of it. This is called a long tom, where they would have to divert water from a stream. So they're not having to dump water from the river back into the rocker. And then the same idea that the quicksilver catches the gold dust. But so they have that technology, but in order to use it, they have to be very cooperative. So whereas the white miners almost always worked individually, Chinese miners worked in groups. They were cooperative, and another reason for their success. And then finally, and I have to give credit to Dr. Li-Peng Zhu at Eastern Washington University, who also describes how Chinese miners were just healthier. In descriptions of the Chinese store and other such ventures along the river, they had gardens. They ate actual green vegetables, which the white miners did not. And they often had doctors who knew how to use medicinal herbs, so that they were also healthy. So all of this is to say that I start off trying to learn about a massacre and end up learning about this whole rich culture that existed along the river. But I was very interested in if the massacre happened, where the massacre happened, and almost the accounts say that the miners were pushed up of a 300-foot bluff, 300-foot high bluff. This is the stretch of river just below BB Bridge Park. And one thing you'll notice is that those bluffs are a whole lot higher than 300 feet high. And they aren't really close enough to the river that, I mean, not to be graphic, but that you could push bodies into the Columbia. And also the level of the Columbia has been raised because of Rocky Reach Dam. And so I was having a hard time finding a site that matched the description. But one day I was out with a couple of friends from Chelan Historical Society, Dave and Sue Klaus, wonderful folks interested in history. And we started looking up, this is the view up the Chelan River Gorge from BB Bridge Park. And as you can see, these bluffs actually do look like they're 300 feet above the river, and you could very easily push someone in. And so we just started positing that maybe that's where it occurred rather than along the river. We just didn't know. We're just walking along these bluffs trying to find a possible location. And all of this is starting to sound like, maybe the massacre didn't happen, maybe it was exaggerated. So I want to, at this point in the presentation, be very clear about the historical context, that whether or not the Chelan Falls massacre happened this was an era of terrible violence against Chinese immigrants all over the West. As early as 1879 in Los Angeles, the Los Angeles Massacre of Chinese immigrants killed 19 people, Chinese. And it happened right, if you know Los Angeles, right where Olvera Street is, right where City Hall is downtown in the middle of the city. That used to be a thriving Chinatown and is no longer. In the late 1870s, Chinese businesses were burned in San Francisco, which we think of still as a thriving center for Chinese immigrants, but there was a huge effort in that era to push them out. 1882, we get the Chinese Exclusion Act, which is the first significant law in the United States restricting immigration, which has huge echoes right now, right? And certainly during these 5 years when I was writing this book, it was hard to think of this story of xenophobia and in particular xenophobia against Asian Americans without thinking of the current context. In the age of COVID, anti-Asian violence went up significantly. And now we're looking back and seeing that we have this long history, not just in our country, but in our region in particular. After the Exclusion Act, you would think that kind of solved the problem. Instead, the violence escalates. And I wouldn't think it solved the problem, but some folks would have. Rock Springs, Wyoming, perhaps the most famous massacre, there are more accounts of it, more written accounts than any of these others I'm describing, with at least 28 dead. The expulsion in Tacoma of the Chinese population, where at least 150 to 200 people were forced out of town. I believe there's an opera or there's a dramatic reenactment of it right now. So people are trying to bring this history to light in lots of different ways. And then in 1887, in Hills Canyon along the Oregon-Idaho border, another massacre of 34 dead, and really mostly due to a reporter at the Portland Oregonian in the early 2000s, Gregory Noakes, who just followed the lead of that story to discover the truth and found actually some treasure trove of written accounts from the perpetrators, from the white attackers that had been hidden away for years and years. So this kind of digging can pay off in uncovering these uncomfortable truths. As far as the Chelan Falls massacre, one of the most problematic issues is that the major written account, so I would find, a number of accounts, but when I traced them back, they all went back to one article from what was the Spokane Spokesman at the time. I got really excited when I found this one. And the article is from 1892, which is 17 years after the supposed event. I was very excited when I found this one in the microfiche at Whitman College from the Chelan Falls Leader, but I quickly discovered that it's actually a reprint. It's the exact same article from the Spokane Spokesman. It's super flowery. It's purple prose. It has a regretful tone. The Chinese, the almond-eyed heathen in large numbers worked the placer diggings, and then the Indians, charged and at them and pushed them over the edge. It's very, very detailed about the merchant and the merchant store. It's very hard to parse how much of this is true, if it's eyewitness, if it's recreated long after the fact. And another troubling aspect of this is if you look at the exact same issue of the Chelan Falls Leader, there's an op-ed, I think you can see it on the screen, saying no Chinese. They're saying that Chinese have never been in Chelan Falls and never should be, and he has the same right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as other human beings have, but his tastes and mode of life are so dissimilar and distasteful to white people, he comes near to being a human swine, it reads, and goes on. And actually, in the same year, there was a movement to exclude Chinese from the city of Wenatchee as well. So The timing of the account of the massacre is problematic. Suggests that there might be other motives for describing a massacre. But the other thread I'm trying to follow, this is one other really interesting document that was uncovered in the early 90s by scholars, which is, it's the Wong Sam phrasebook. So it's an English to Chinese phrasebook that was available, published in 1875. It was available at like Wells Fargo, like Pony Express stops. So it would be for common use for these miners or for laborers. Just a phrasebook, so you can say things in English that you need to say. And some of them are make a lot of sense. I want to get a pair of your best pants, but a huge proportion of them speak of violence. He assaulted me without provocation. Don't fear that I am cheating you. He perjured himself in court. It speaks to a life. He took it from me by violence. And it goes on and on like this for pages. So it gives a sense of how much fear of violence and how much, real unrest there was around these Chinese miners who were here for such a long time. The other part of the story that I was trying to chase down was this idea that perhaps the perpetrators weren't indigenous people, but actually white people. This is the page from Bill Lehman's book, Native River, that talks about Chua Yu, the later merchant who told the story. So the picture there is a later merchant after Chi or Chisa, who told the story of it being perpetrated by white people. And I couldn't find any other source that substantiated this, but I figured the best source would probably be someone in the indigenous community, someone with the Chelan tribe. Bill Lehman has a collaborator he works with often named Randy Lewis, who is an elder with the Chelan tribe. And I ended up joining Bill and Randy at what's called Wanapum Heritage Days, which I so highly recommend to anyone interested in the indigenous cultures and histories along the Columbia River. The Wanapum tribe have a great cultural center, and they have this event where they bring people in. They have lots of different presentations on archaeology and on culture, and they serve a huge potluck meal. I mean, it's not potluck, they serve a meal of salmon and wonderful food. And so I'm gonna pick up the story again, because the story just gets stranger and stranger the further that I research. And this is my encounter with Randy Lewis at Wanapum Days. I should also say that when I went, I was very interested in talking to archaeologists, and I had somehow, as we do when we're in research, we forget the most obvious things, which is that I have a good friend, Bob Mirendorf, who was the archaeologist for North Cascades National Park, who would have known a lot about this. I just had forgotten to ask him, and he plays into this section that I will read from the book, my encounter at first with Randy Lewis. Randy Lewis is a tall man, more than a foot taller than me, quick-witted, with a disconcertingly steady gaze, warm and skeptical at once. Google him and you learn he's a veteran of the American Indian rights movement of the 1970s, a participant in the occupation of Alcatraz, an author and a dedicated keeper of oral tradition along the Columbia River. Meet him in person and you get straight talk. What do you know about the Chelan Falls Massacre? I asked. Oh, you mean that time when the white guys dressed up as Indians? I nodded uncertainly. Do you know exactly where it happened? I asked. Over by the springs, he said. He described the pullout where I'd walked near BB Springs. And so it was the white guys that did it? Yes, he said, no hesitance whatsoever. I looked at his expression for context or elaboration. He looked neither angry nor amused, not sad nor boastful. He was simply stating the truth, and he expected me to accept it. They always say it was the Indians. A couple of Chelans were put in jail, but that's not what happened. I had never heard of anyone going to jail. He told me his great uncle, as a boy, overheard a group of white men bragging about the murders in a corner tavern. This would have been years after the actual event. The town grown larger, I pictured the boy pushing a broom over rough-sawn floorboards or washing dishes in a steel bin, unnoticed or not worth noticing, as drunk men in suit coats leaned back to crow loudly. You know that tavern? Randy asked. We were holding overfull paper plates of food and holding up the line, too. I do, I said. He nodded as if that sealed the deal, and he walked away. After lunch, I skipped the presentations and instead watched demonstrations on the patio outside. In my eagerness to speak to Randy, I had forgotten about Bob Mierendorf and to ask if he knew anything about the massacre. I found him in the lobby and asked. Oh, he'd heard the story all right. And not only that, he'd worked on the archaeology survey of the Chinese store area at Beebe Bridge in the late 1980s. He didn't remember finding any artifacts. But there was something, Bob said. Nodding thoughtfully, he called out to a woman I will call Vicky, standing in the crowded lobby, an old friend of his who had worked on the Beebe Bridge project. He explained my interest in the massacre and asked if she remembered the dig. Yes, yes, she said. She answered breathlessly, almost nervously. In fact, it was the strangest thing. They were doing test excavation, she explained. Their heads would be down in this tiny hole, and as she was digging, alone in her assigned area, she kept feeling a presence, like hearing the sound someone makes when approaching, tools jangling, or footsteps. She'd come up and look around and not see anyone. I don't remember hearing voices, she said, not exactly. At some point she decided enough is enough, and she just sat waiting. Something made me think of the Chinese. Maybe one of the landowners had mentioned them and alluded to trouble, but I certainly hadn't heard about the massacre, not back then. I learned about it much later. Did you feel spooked? I asked. Yes, she said, that is the word for it. Later, when I followed up on the phone, she told me how she'd done tons of solo hiking and camping in a life spent outdoors and had never felt anything like that anywhere else, before or after. In the moment, in the bustling lobby of the Heritage Center, she paused, and then she added one more detail. The thing is, it felt like children. You know, the way kids like to romp. It felt like a child ran by, that brush or breeze. Children, I asked. She nodded, and the conversation flagged. Her story was too chilling, too hard to process, so we retreated into easier territory. Where exactly were they? Bob believed it was closer to the store, though Vicky disagreed, and she had no patience for guessing games. She pulled up Google Earth on her phone and pointed to an alluvial fan protruding into the river north of the bridge, now covered in orchards, a place not mentioned in any version of the story I'd heard. It was on the far side of the river from the location Dave and Sue Klaus and I had picked out. It was, in fact, on the opposite side of the river from every single existing description places the massacre, almost directly across from Beebe Springs, where Randy Lewis said the massacre occurred. She said she was 100% sure that is where they were. As we talked, Randy Lewis passed by, headed toward the patio where the last of the afternoon sunlight reflected off the river. I reached out to touch his arm. Randy, wait. Which side of the river did you say the massacre was on? Well, actually, both sides, he said, right there by the springs and also across the river. They killed the men on one side and the women and children on the other side. I was stunned. Not one account of the massacre had suggested massacres on two sides of the river. None mentioned women and children. Randy had never met Vicky. There was no way he could have overheard our conversation in the crowded lobby. When we described Vicky's experience to him, he nodded solemnly as if to say, of course. Randy Lewis was the only one among us completely unsurprised that the truth might be radically different from any story we've been told. So over and over, as I did this research, I would be sobered by the things that come up, right? By the things that don't appear in writing, by the things that you can't substantiate, by the things that may or may not be true, and the ways that people remember things. After talking to Randy, I met this gentleman, Arnie Marchand, who is also a writer. He refuses to consider himself an elder of the Confederated Tribes of the Colville Reservation, but he is certainly a spokesperson for his people. Like I said, a historian and a writer in his own regard. I ran into him at the Depot Museum in Oroville one day, and I asked him what he knew about the Chelan Falls Massacre, and he said, "Oh, you mean when we killed all those Chinese?" And I said, "What do you mean when you killed all those Chinese?" And he said, "Well, you know, we were tired of them. They were in our space. We killed 700 of them." And I thought, that's just crazy talk. I left the museum and I went home and I started writing it up in the book. And I thought, I can't do this. I've got to go back and see if that's really what he said. So I drove back up to Oroville and spent a whole day driving around with Arnie. And Arnie's perspective is really interesting. There's a chapter in the book that tries to capture it. And his perspective is basically like, why am I so worried about the Chinese? Why are people so worried about the Chinese? He says, my people have been here for tens of thousands of years, and the Chinese were here for, 5 or 10 years or 20 years in the late 1800s, which is the only time anyone wants to hear about because it's the John Wayne period. And he said, forget John Wayne. Like, he wanted to tell me about their culture, and he drove me around. And I mean, Arnie can be a character, and that's great for a writer. A writer always wants a character. But I also really want to honor his perspective, because he did double down over and over that they killed 700. I don't know where he gets that information or why he believes it, but I know why he wants to tell other stories and not the stories of the Chinese. It makes perfect sense. He also admitted that he didn't know a whole lot about it. I also want to point out that standing behind him there are Kay and Mike Sibley, also of the Borderlands Historical Society up in Oroville. Really wonderful, knowledgeable people about that region, which is the region where Chisaw is, which is why I was up there, the town named after Achi. So Arnie says, I don't know anything. You should meet my friend Dorothy. You need to talk to my friend Dorothy. Dorothy's in her 80s, Dorothy Petrie. And she became my pen pal. She did know a lot. She knew an awful lot about Chisaw the man, if not about the massacres. And she is a dogged researcher. So together we did so much work, and I'm so grateful to her. But she said, come on up to Chisaw, and we're going to find Chisaw's grave. I'm pretty sure we can find where he's buried. And I thought that sounded great. I'll go on any adventure. So here we are. There's Dorothy getting through the barbed wire. We got permission to cross onto this private property. We're going out to look for Chisaw's grave up there in Chisaw, learn what we can. And then surprises in research never cease. And so we got to where we were going to find his grave, and Dorothy got out her crystal. And so she was going to do grave dowsing by asking questions of her crystal. And again, that's easy to make into a fun story, but also she has a lot of faith in that crystal. And she asked it a lot of hard questions about the native people that might be buried there as well. Later, we went on another adventure described in the book where we did go to the massacre sites. And it wasn't so fun anymore. When the crystal, she would ask it, did a massacre take place here? Did it take place here? And it seemed like the only answer was yes, 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 which may be the truth of the matter, right? Maybe the truth that it wasn't one massacre that happened on one bluff in the Columbia River, but violence that was pervasive at that time. So there's truth in all kinds of corners, right? As you're out doing these things. The one major question, and I'm sure it's occurred to everyone listening as you hear me go on and on about this, is if this happened, where are the bones? What happened to the bodies? And not only where, in any massacre you would wonder that, but To Chinese immigrants in particular, to Chinese people, bones are important. The big six companies would actually hire bone collectors to come and collect the bones of miners who died, of laborers on the railroad who died, and bring them back to their home place, repatriate them to their villages in China. And they did this according to very strict rules. You can very easy to find the rules for collecting bones to bring back to China. And this is a man who found me late in my research. I had published an excerpt from the book, and Dr. Raymond Chong is not an academic or a historian. He is an engineer who has a passion for the history of Chinese immigrants and was very interested in the Chelan Falls Massacre. And he said, if this happened, he had sources. He is a descendant of what they call Gold Mountain sojourners, of the gold miners who came not necessarily to this area. I think his ancestors went to California, but they went back home. And he went back and found them there and has close ties. And so he spent time, asking around with the people that he knew in China and in this country about, would it be possible for this many murders to have happened without the bones to track down? And he does not. So that seemed to be, if there's a final say, although Raymond would agree, interestingly, with Dorothy Petrie, that he thinks probably the story stems from some truth, right? The truth of killings of miners in large numbers, because they could be because of xenophobia perpetrated by indigenous people and or white people, but probably not 300 right there in that place. And I'm grateful to Raymond for his support in this story. And before I end and end on that, giving away the end of my book, I hope you still read the book. I want to say one more thing, and this is what a large part of the last section of the book is about, is that there is actually a long tradition in the American West of fake massacres. And if you go to a place called Almo, Idaho, there is a monument there to some, folks, pioneers coming across on the Oregon Trail and who were supposedly massacred by Shoshone people. It absolutely did not happen. It's been disproven over and over again, but the people of Almo will not take down their monument. My good friend, the historian Larry Sabula from Eastern Washington University, early in my research, he said something to me. He said, people love their massacres. And I thought that was the craziest thing I had ever heard. But this is what he was referring to, right? That people want to glamorize the violence. And the point, the very strong point I want to make here is that those glamorized massacres, those made up massacres, are very often ones where the victims are white people. And the underreported massacres, the massacres we under exaggerate or try to ignore, are the ones that when indigenous people were the victims. So if you think about the Bear Creek Massacre in Colorado, or Sand Creek in Idaho, or Marias in Montana, these are stories where, thousands, many hundreds of Indians were killed. Thousands was an exaggeration. I don't want to do that. But many, many indigenous people were killed. And then there's no monument, but there's the monument in Almo to the made-up massacre. And so I think we do a disservice. This is an interesting story, the Chelan Falls Massacre. You do a disservice to say that no violence happened, right? To deny the violence. You play into the Alex Joneses of the world who want to act as though what really happened didn't happen. And so as much as this story has been fascinating to me and trying to find out the truth and trying to uncover it, coming to this conclusion of there may not be a direct answer has real repercussions in the world. So I'm going to leave it right there in that spot. I want to stop sharing. That was a lot in a short amount of time. But I'm happy to answer any questions that anyone has about any part of that saga.
I'd like to say, listening to your conclusion, it brought to mind Dr. Vernon Carstensen of the University of Washington's statement that's forever burned in my mind. And it was, remember, the written word is not always right, and the unspoken word is not always wrong. Wonderful presentation. Thank you. I've enjoyed it.
Thank you so much, and thank you for that. I think that is one of the hugest takeaways for me in this whole project, is what's unwritten is there's still truth there, right? We rely on the written records so heavily. Yeah.
Other comments? I forgot to say our usual routine is we have people put questions in the chat function, but I didn't say that. So people are certainly welcome to ask questions live.
Question there?
No. Raise your hand in your picture.
Hey, Herb, you have a question?
Yeah, same question I asked you before. When's the sequel? We're sitting here with the Binghams and Stehekin watching you, enjoying every minute.
Hi, Adele and Dick. Nice to see you.
We're going to buy the book.
There you go. Thanks.
And I will not lend them mine.
Oh, they have to get their own. That's how it works. Yeah.
Other questions for Anna Maria? Okay. And somebody may have something they're just thinking about. While they're thinking, I will say thank you very much, Anna Maria. It's been a pleasure. And let me look up. I was going to tell you about what's going on next month. We have a presentation next month for our annual meeting called Stomp and Shout, the Untold Story of Early Northwest Rock and Roll. And Peter Blecka will tell the story of music in the Pacific Northwest from the 1940s to the 1960s, which was a golden era that shaped generations of music to come. So we welcome you next month. In the meantime, if you have presentations or thoughts about participating in the Historian or the History Conference, September 23rd, in the downtown library in downtown Seattle, we welcome your presentations. So send us proposals. Anna Maria, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much. And thank you all for attending. Good night.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great night. Good to see you.